Welcome to episode 5 of the Perfect Storm podcast, an ongoing discussion around the convergence of 3 big ideas: mental health, organized religion, and creative aspirations. I'm your host, Michael Varnado, and I thank you for joining me. It's been 3 months since I uploaded episode 4, which was the final establishing post for the channel. Not long after it was published, in late February, the COVID-19 pandemic began to spread across the U.S. I'm happy to report that my family is healthy and we haven't had any major setbacks due to the current situation. Fairly early in the coronavirus drama, I transitioned to working my day job exclusively from home. With the privilege of working from home comes a higher degree of scrutiny over my productivity. Working harder all day long to justify my billable hours often leaves me sort of drained by the end of the day. Between the sudden lifestyle change and my ongoing concerns about health and safety, I struggled to prioritize the completion of today's episode. One thing I envisioned for this channel from the beginning was to tell my story as it continues to unfold. In other words, I wanted to document my mental health journey and report on my healing experiences in real time. Before I could do that, I felt I should establish the premise of Perfect Storm and provide additional insight into its 3 main components. Now that I've done so, I'd like to take this time to catch you up on what's been going on in therapy. There was an 8-month gap between when I began seeing my therapist and when I launched Perfect Storm. Plus, it's taken a while to get to the point where I can begin to evaluate how therapy is going. Bottom line, there's a lot to review. But once we're all caught up, mental health updates can become a recurring segment on the podcast. For those of you who are considering therapy for the first time, or it's been a while and you're considering going back, hopefully this will pique your curiosity about what could lie in store for you. So let's take a closer look at what I've experienced in trauma therapy so far. I've been in counseling for 14 months, trying to emphasize healing and personal growth while balancing work, family, and this channel. I found my current therapist through a referral from a marriage counselor that I'd seen with my wife back in 2016. I actually got the trauma referral during marriage counseling, but circumstances were such that I chose to postpone individual counseling to focus on much needed work opportunities. In the spring of 2018, I read a book called 12 Rules for Life that helped me make the decision to prioritize my mental health over things like career development. That fall, an opportunity arose to move away from project work and accept a permanent position with a different employer. The job offer came with a lesser title and earning potential, but more stability and a better work-life balance, not to mention full benefits. In March of 2019, I began seeing my trauma counselor. As to how I chose her, frankly, she had the winning combination of being referred by her marriage counselor and covered by my new health insurance. Given this, I had no expectations that the first counselor I tried would be the best possible option for me. We approached the first month or so of our therapeutic relationship as a trial run. On paper, she had impressive credentials, including a PhD. However, she worked for an organization that already had 2 strikes against it in my book. Firstly, this organization is a ministry. And for those of you familiar with the premise of Perfect Storm, you're aware that I no longer have any interest in organized religion. Strike 2 was that years prior, the last time I'd approached this ministry about counseling services, I'd met with this so-called counselor, a man that I wanted to punch in the face by the end of our conversation. Going in with 2 strikes was not a great way to start a new therapeutic relationship. And it wouldn't be long before we reached what looked like an impasse. See, this trauma specialist was only available to meet with me every other week in the beginning. I would find out later that this was her default arrangement, meaning that for us to meet weekly, she would have to make an exception for me, as well as find the openings in her schedule. I was eager to deep dive into healing, and I was also accustomed to weekly visits with previous counselors. so the 2 weeks between visits felt like an eternity. To me, I was long overdue for this type of treatment. I was desperate to get healing, but also to ease my immediate suffering. I was screaming for morphine and she was offering me baby Tylenol. What's worse is that the early sessions were very dry. It was a lot of filling out forms and taking various assessments. I had arrived on day one ready to explore my trauma history and personal narrative in great detail, holding nothing back, leaving no stone unturned. But it just seemed like we couldn't get any momentum going. About 5 weeks in, I contacted my counselor and asked for a referral to someone else that could see me every week. I felt comfortable doing this because, like I said, we both had approached this acknowledging that it may not work out. I was not interested in having to convince her to see me more often if she was reluctant to do so. She asked me how I felt about the work we were doing. She wanted to know if seeing her more often would be preferable to finding another trauma specialist. I hadn't expected her response necessarily, but I did know it was too early to rule her out as an option. To my surprise, she agreed to transition to seeing me weekly. It would require some changes in her availability, which didn't quite work out until a couple of months later in June. I decided to wait patiently until the weekly visits began, but before that transition could happen, our therapeutic relationship was tested yet again. This time, it was after I had sort of a breakdown on Mother's Day last year. Since I entered adulthood, my relationship with my mother has been continuously strained. Being around her often leaves me feeling sad, frustrated, and concerned for her well-being. Sometimes, though, it's much worse. A lot of unresolved issues get stirred up, and at times it seems that my own life is doomed to follow the same dreadful patterns I see in my mother's life. I got so upset last Mother's Day that I really started to question whether life was worth living. Whether I would remain stuck in a self-perpetuating nightmare and pass significant psychological baggage down to my own child. I felt compelled to just end it all. And my wife said she wanted to contact my therapist ASAP the next morning. I anticipated a less than desirable outcome from involving my therapist in this mental health event, which was sort of a red flag for me. Why wouldn't I expect a helpful response from my trauma specialist during my time of greatest need? Then, when things played out exactly how I expected them to, what started as a fleeting thought became a legitimate concern. It just seemed like the therapist went cold on me, like she didn't take me seriously or as though she had just resorted to protocol. I didn't feel felt, as they say, and in the weeks that followed, my guard was up. I was probably at risk of abandoning this relationship if one more thing went wrong, but thankfully my therapist took the initiative and addressed the situation in a way that I found reassuring. So for the past 11 months, we've been meeting weekly. In mid-March of this year, New Orleans became a hotspot for COVID-19, and our governor began pushing social distancing to flatten the curve. Taking cues from my state government, my employer approved my request and immediately transitioned me to working from home full-time. The following week, my counselor's office transitioned to meeting with clients exclusively through a video conferencing service. This was supposed to be a 2-week arrangement that I could opt out of at any time and temporarily forego counseling. However, as the pandemic raged on, 2 weeks became 2 months of meeting my counselor this way. This wasn't a difficult transition. I'm already comfortable doing serious collaborative work remotely in my professional life. I continued to be diligent with therapy homework and recommended books and podcasts. I haven't noticed a significant drop in quality of service over video, but there have been moments when certain exercises proved ineffective. Perhaps I'm too accommodating and I've set my expectations too low. With that in mind, I've taken some time to reflect on what benefits I've experienced from 14 months of trauma therapy. After all, I anticipated that I could accomplish a major mental health transformation over 2 years, and we're more than halfway through that period. I've tried to be patient and reserve judgment, but there have been some weeks that felt like throwaways when I questioned her methods and whether I was making real progress with her. Maybe even wondered if she was very prepared, if she could remember details from previous sessions. I'm glad that I've taken the time to inventory what I'm learning because I haven't taken notes after each session or journaled about my experiences so far. There were times when I didn't have the bandwidth to do so, and other times when I suspected that analyzing and reporting on the process could interfere with it. I no longer have this concern and will be more intentional with the time we have left. What I'd like to do now is kind of get into the weeds with what I've been learning in therapy. It will be a little dry and technical at times. If this stuff doesn't interest you at any point, feel free to jump to this timestamp to skip to the next section where I explain what I'm learning apart from my therapist. So let's jump into what I've learned from my therapist so far. I understand more about what trauma really is. The ACE questionnaire validated my views on my trauma history. It revealed that I belong to a large segment of society who's had adverse childhood experiences with predictable and potentially lifelong outcomes. I'm legitimately suffering, and there are valid reasons. Another thing, early on we were able to identify anger as a pressing issue, more so than focus, depression, anxiety, OCD, or addiction. This made so much sense once I acknowledged it. I took it as a sobering reminder that the anger had crept in during my elementary school years and only intensified with life's disappointments and heartbreaks. And it's never really gone away. Next, there are important distinctions between discussing ideas and feelings. It's imprecise to start a statement with, "I feel like," when you're describing a thought, belief, or judgment. It's important to use feeling words to describe actual feelings. For example, rather than say, "I feel like punching you in the face," try, "I feel intense anger towards you, and right now I have an overwhelming urge to punch you in the face." Then, of course, there's the genogram. I didn't need to make this chart to know that my family was a bunch of predatory animals, but it continues to serve multiple purposes. The process of making it has been cathartic, validating my suffering and deepening my knowledge of trauma and my family history. We've referred to it many times in therapy sessions to aid discussion. Now that it's really fleshed out, it serves as a powerful visual reminder as to my origins, grounding me in reality and giving others a window into my background. I learned about special play, which is sort of a child-directed playtime where you give your child your undivided attention, minimizing any distractions that would stop you from engaging with one another. It's not meant to be structured, such as playing a game with rules. You should resist the impulse to control what happens or turn anything into a teachable moment. You can start with, say, 15 minutes a day and then build from there. I learned that doing this with my daughter every day could do wonders for her mental health and our relationship. Then there's the benefits of mindfulness, meditation, and left-right brain integration. This is really important when it comes to neurological repair, healthy affect regulation, even during times of high stress, and a healthy self-awareness. The surprising severity of my abandonment issues was recently revealed to me through a mindfulness exercise. I also learned about a concept called map of the soul, which comes from the IFS school of thought. IFS stands for Internal Family Systems. From Psychology Today, internal family systems is an approach to psychotherapy that identifies and addresses multiple subpersonalities or families within each person's mental system. These subpersonalities consist of wounded parts and painful emotions such as anger and shame, and parts that try to control and protect the person from the pain of the wounded parts. The subpersonalities are often in conflict with each other and with one's core self, a concept that describes the confident, compassionate, whole person that is at the core of every individual. IFS focuses on healing the wounded parts and restoring mental balance and harmony by changing the dynamics that create discord among the subpersonalities and the self. I'm going to put a graphic on screen in case you're watching so you can follow along here. My therapist explained that the emotionally wounded parts of me and feelings associated with those wounds are known as exiles. Then there are two additional subpersonalities who want to protect the exile. These two are known as managers and firefighters. Managers have various ways of protecting you from pain before it starts, none of which are particularly healthy or honest. When you tell yourself to suck it up and deal, that's your manager. Firefighters come in to extinguish pain once it starts, and like actual firefighters, tend to cause significant collateral damage. This might be eating cheeseburgers for every meal or getting drunk. While both work to sort of conceal and protect the exile, both of them would just as soon keep the exiles in banishment, where it's easier to keep them safe. I found this idea to be a bit dull until I made a startling personal revelation of how this plays out in my daily life. I've realized that there is this sort of Golem-Smeagol dynamic between the manager and the exile within me. The manager comes to the exile much like Gollum comes to Smeagol in Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. At times when I'm feeling hurt and vulnerable and I try to acknowledge and validate my own suffering, he magically appears as though summoned by my so-called self-pity. He needs to protect those more vulnerable aspects of me, but at the same time, he has contempt for those exiled voices. He judges them as weak and pathetic, and would rather they just stay in exile than risk exposing us to ridicule. It's an ugly and complicated dynamic, but I continue to understand more how this affects me. So now we can talk about attachment style. The style in which you attach to your primary caregiver during your developmental years tends to determine much of your overall life experience. There are two broad categories: secure and insecure attachment. From there, insecure attachment can be broken down into three types. Understanding your attachment to your primary caregiver and whether it was secure can aptly predict the dynamics of how you interact with others. It can also inform how one would recover from the various types of insecure attachment and form what's known as an earned secure attachment. Early on in counseling, one assessment I took was sort of a life balance wheel. There are many variations of this wheel online. The counselor provided some categories to place on the wheel, and then we worked together to identify a few more. I think I remember most of them: sleep, nutrition, exercise, creativity, family, friendship, spirituality. I had to assess myself according to these areas, and then we set goals to make improvements where needed. I had neglected my physical health pretty badly, so I committed to start taking better care of myself. However, I didn't follow through on this right away. There were some setbacks, including a foot injury, and then there was the holiday season. However, right after I posted episode 4, I took a health assessment for work, the results of which motivated me to get started. I've lost 20 pounds since I posted the last episode a few months ago. What's even more exciting, it's obvious to me that I'm beginning to turn a corner with regard to food and other self-destructive coping mechanisms. I always suspected that my struggles with diet and exercise were tied to deep-seated psychological issues. As my mental health improves, I find it easier to sleep more, move more, hydrate more, and eat less. I feel food is losing its power over me while exercise becomes a go-to for stress relief, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle that actually helps me rather than harm me. Another benefit that started somewhat early in the process was when my therapist introduced me to the work of another therapist and podcaster, Adam Young, who is heavily influenced by the work of Dan Allender. Adam Young's podcast has really helped me understand more about myself while introducing lots of new information about neuroscience in general, emotional affect regulation, the Big Six, which is a list of 6 critical things children need from their parents for health and stability. Of the 6, I found that something called attunement was missing most in my closest relationships, and this started with my parents. I've read 5 or 6 books so far. The first one was The Body Keeps the Score. This helped me to understand developmental trauma disorder, what I believe to be the best fit for me in terms of a diagnosis. The book also goes into a lot of detail on something called EMDR, which is a therapeutic tool that I believe gave me profound insight to a significant event in my life when at just 6 years old, I changed my name from Corey to Michael without explanation, and my parents just went along with it. Another book I read was Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters, which sort of strengthened my understanding of the importance of the father-daughter dynamic, and it also provided a preview of what could lie ahead in raising a daughter. Another book recommended by my therapist was Silently Seduced: When Parents Make Their Children Partners. This book opened my eyes to a complicated, controversial idea that my therapist broached with me known as covert sexual abuse. I was not very receptive to the idea at first. Apparently this is a very typical reaction, so my counselor recommended this book written by an expert and pioneer on the topic. In an interview about his book with Psychology Today, which I'll link to in the description, the author Kenneth M. Adams is asked, in the simplest terms, what is covert incest? To which he replies, covert incest describes a relationship between a parent and child in which the child feels more like a romantic partner. Typically, the parent is motivated by the loneliness and emptiness of a troubled marriage, so he or she turns the child into a surrogate partner. There's not necessarily any kind of overt sexual touching, but the relationship feels too close for comfort to the child. The boundaries are such that there is an incestuous feeling. The child feels used and trapped, the same as with overt incest. This abuse exists on a spectrum, and I never experienced any explicit language, nudity, inappropriate proximity, or touch. It was more of a relationship dynamic that started to become very apparent to me during my single adult years when we lived together. Anyway, the long-term psychological impact on a victim of this type of abuse is catastrophic. Another book I read was called Anatomy of the Soul. This book strongly reinforced the important benefits of mindfulness and left-right brain integration. It taught me better coping skills and communication skills, which I've already begun to implement to great effect with my wife and daughter. The book I finished most recently is called Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child. This book gave me the confidence to lean into my daughter during some of her most difficult, emotionally charged moments because I now have practical tools to help her. I can improve our relationship while also teaching her how to regulate her emotional world. It also addresses some of the unique challenges of parenting when you have unresolved childhood trauma from your primary caregivers. I now understand how my child's outward emotional expressions can trigger my own unresolved childhood shame. I might react by attempting to suppress her emotions in hopes that this will relieve feelings of shame that come up in me during these moments. Say you're out in public or in mixed company with your child, and he or she throws a tantrum. You might be tempted to respond by sort of slagging the child off, minimizing their emotions, even mocking them out of your own shame. Perhaps it's shame over your parenting shortfalls or unresolved shame from your own past. Even milder expressions of emotions on the part of your child can trigger a shame response in you. Trying to extinguish that shame at your child's expense is likely to deeply wound your child and erode his or her trust in you. I also learned about parenting styles from this book, but it was actually way before I read the book. I've discovered that I naturally tend more toward the emotional coach parenting style, which is the most desirable approach, while I scored significantly lower than my wife did in the less desirable approaches. My wife is improving, the point being that I shouldn't be afraid to move toward my daughter because, as it turns out, I have some natural strength that my daughter needs me to bring to bear in our relationship. So I've learned a lot from my counselor and the resources she has shared. There have also been some things that I discovered on my own leading up to and during trauma therapy. I've always been a deeply introspective person who regularly analyzes my thoughts, feelings, and actions. I've discovered and processed a lot on my own, much of which became the groundwork for later healing. For one, I was fascinated by the concept of the lobster from 12 Rules for Life and how closely our neurology resembles that of these ancient creatures. I like what this chapter of the book says about the hierarchy among living creatures. More personally, I could really relate to the example of the lobster who gets a limb ripped off during an altercation. and how this could impact his neurology and thereby his behavior, setting off a chain reaction that reframes the rest of his life. So yeah, 12 Rules for Life. Wonderful book. I might have to go back and read it again and review it. I had to face the fact that a significant chunk of the interpersonal problems I experience could be about insecurity and resentment on the part of others, not just my own. It's interesting to imagine that even I had the capability to stir resentment in others, just by my existence, my presence, or my attempts to build a good life for myself. In a world of finite resources, everyone seems to be in competition, and they all seem to be operating under the assumption that we're in a zero-sum game. I didn't want to believe that resentment was such a big part of everyday life, but it's true, and I would do well to remember this. Another thing I realize is how much stress and tension I carry in my shoulders and how much of an impact desk work has on my upper body. I experienced a dramatic reduction in head and muscle aches once I began exercising every day. I've also learned that I still maintain the ability to transform. My progress leads the way for my wife and daughter to follow as well. We're already seeing improvements. My wife is even committed to intercounseling as the economy reopens, which is a major step that could revolutionize our marriage and family. I also realized that I had a tendency to self-sabotage. My current circumstances are eerily similar to where I was 15 years ago when I went to counseling for the first time. I made some great decisions and some terrible mistakes back then. Since starting counseling last year, I've caught myself allowing my passion for perfect storm to, at times, interfere with both my work performance and what we're doing in counseling. Thankfully, this time I had the wisdom and control to put perfect storm on the back burner as needed to maintain balance in my life and protect the most important things. I also enjoyed an extended period of healthy interaction with my sister and came to understand more about her through the literature I read. This continued into my current counseling relationship, but certainly began before that. We have hit a snag though. There is still much work to do in repairing that relationship, and I'm hopeful that things will get back on track. Early in my second year of trauma therapy, my focus has now shifted. I have a goal to relieve the strain on and dramatically improve the quality of my interpersonal relationships. The single most pressing interpersonal conflict I have now has to do with a toxic work environment. There are some people at work who are hostile, and others who enable this hostility. I don't want to run from this issue anymore. It's only going to follow me around wherever I go because I'm me, and most workplaces have these types of people. I want to stand against those who would do me harm in pursuit of their own individual agendas. I want to thrive, even in the presence of an enemy. Relative to the difficult workplace scenario, mindfulness has allowed me to identify the single biggest stressor surrounding the workplace. I feel like I'm trapped. I sometimes struggle with the thought that I was lucky to land this job. It is literally the only option I know of that would allow me to, for one, leverage my disaster recovery experience, earn a good salary with full benefits, work a consistent 40-hour per week schedule and be with my family every night, and work from home on a regular basis. It's very stressful to feel so vulnerable, as though one wrong move will bring this whole thing crashing down on top of me. Finally, I've explored what it means to be high in trait neuroticism, which will serve as a nice segue to my secondary topic for today's episode. To finish things up, I want to shift focus to the idea of strained interpersonal relationships, a recurring theme in my life so far. One's mental health is inexorably tied to the quality of one's interpersonal relationships. The young brain cannot develop properly without stable, healthy connection to its primary caregivers, and eventually to others. Likewise, it will be quite difficult to establish or sustain healthy connection to others while nursing a wounded, maladapted mind. I wish I'd understood more about the social aspects of human existence when I was a young man. There is wisdom in the idiom birds of a feather. Healthy people tend to attract other healthy people, and likewise with unhealthy people. Since I grew up in a toxic household, I went out into the world and formed toxic relationships with other toxic people. These relationships tended to be fraught with conflict, unstable, and destined to fail. The end of a friendship, or my expulsion from a group, was usually followed by an extended period of isolation before I made new friends. I didn't enjoy such lonely seasons, nor did I make a conscious effort to withdraw socially. I simply lacked the social skills and personality traits that would promote a quick transition into new relationships. What maturity I did develop was imbalanced. I was lost, confused, naive, and vulnerable. My profound loneliness always drew me back into relationships eventually. But since my core issues remained unresolved, I tended to recreate old relationship dynamics with new people, not to mention reconnecting with toxic people from my past. It's been said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I didn't learn the right lessons from my mistakes, so remember them or not, I was destined to make them again. Since I didn't attract healthy people, I felt trapped in this binary where I had to choose between unhealthy relationships or social isolation. After all, human beings are social creatures who thrive in groups and suffer in extended isolation, regardless of how introverted they may be. This is a recurring theme in all the books, TED Talks, and podcasts I've consumed over the past 14 months. We need one another, and the quality of our interpersonal relationships is crucial to our mental and even physical health. I've yet to take the Big 5 personality test, but I know a little bit about it. It aims to determine where you fall on 5 personality spectrums: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If I had to guess, I'd say I'm more open than not, more conscientious than not, a little too agreeable, and not quite extroverted enough. I believe that the most problematic area for me in the 5-factor model is that I am pretty high in neuroticism, which contributes significantly to my suffering in relationships and as an individual. I recently read an article about this in Psychology Today, which I'll link to in the description, and I was beside myself as I read the following passage. While neuroticism has its benefits, such as intelligence, humor, more realistic, if cynical, expectations, greater self-awareness, drivenness, and conscientiousness, lower risk-taking, and a strong need to provide for others, it is also associated with self-criticism, sensitivity to others, social anxiety, moodiness and anxiety, poorer general health, greater day-to-day strain, and strong negative emotional reactions. As a result, neurotic people on average tend to find romantic, personal, and family relationships more effortful and less successful than desired, have problems keeping jobs, and generally aren't as satisfied with life. More neurotic people may find themselves trapped in maladaptive thought patterns which they compulsively defend. So impoverished is their sense of self that it is necessary to cling to even negative self-attributions because the prospect of positive change itself feels like a threat to their integrity, an unacceptable risk of losing oneself by morphing into a different person. Suggestions by other people to change or pressure from the workplace to function better interpersonally are hard to swallow, feeling more like unjust attacks and false critiques than efforts to be supportive and constructive. In stronger neuroticism, perfect is the enemy of good, as we imagine impossible ideals for oneself and others which protect us from the painstaking work of gradual change. People who are high in neuroticism value the safety of knowing what to expect, even if it is bleak, over the risk of disappointment from trying to engage in unfamiliar and unproven ways. While I'm completely blown away at how well this describes me, I'm also sort of skeptical as to the plasticity of personality. We know that personality is a combination of nature and nurture, though there doesn't appear to be a scientific consensus as to the ratios. To the extent that personality comes from nurture, that is to say environmental factors, life experience, I have to believe that some of my neuroticism is the result of past trauma. I believe I can heal from past trauma, as well as develop strategies for offsetting the negative aspects of my neuroticism. I believe this would dramatically improve my quality of life and relationships. This is my heart's desire, to build strong ties and thrive in community with others. Maybe with someone hearing my words right now.